Excuse me. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us here today. Schoolhouse Connections State Policy Priorities and Engagement webinar. Really appreciate you taking the time out of your schedules to be part of this conversation. As we get going, just a couple quick housekeeping items. Webinar is going to last 1 hour. We do have a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we would ask that you utilize the Q&A function, and we'll try and monitor those as we go to make sure that we respond as we're able to, but we'll also definitely have some time at the end for questions. So please feel free to put the question in when you think of it so you don't forget it, but know that we'll also have time for discussion at the end. The session is being recorded, as you may have noticed, and the slide deck will be shared. We'll put a link in the chat, and you'll also get an email follow-up. So with that, I want to introduce myself and my co-presenter here. So my name is Elliot Williams with Schoolhouse Connection. I'm the Senior State Policy Program Manager, and I'll be joined by Rod Motz, the Director of State Policy, who will be taking us through some of the slides a little bit later in the webinar. In case you aren't familiar with Schoolhouse Connection, we are an organization that works to overcome homelessness from prenatal to post-secondary through strategic advocacy and practical assistance in partnership with youth, families, schools, early childhood programs, institutions of higher education, and service providers. And I really encourage you to learn more by going to our website that has a wealth of resources and information, and also signing up for our newsletter. Well, today we're really going to be focusing on the advocacy piece of our work, primarily the state advocacy, and I'll talk a moment also about some of the federal policy advocacy. Know that there are a lot of other pieces to the work that Schoolhouse Connection does, and as I said, I encourage you to go to the website to learn more about those. I'll also say there's a couple more webinars coming up from Schoolhouse Connection that you might be interested in, including one as soon as next week with our partners at the National Network for Youth, looking at what work is yet to be done in the final days of the 118th Congress. And then next month, on January 14th, we'll have a webinar similar to this, where we'll be looking at federal policy and some of the opportunities and issues that Schoolhouse Connection will be focusing on in the next Congress. So let's take a look at our agenda here quickly. We're going to start by going through an overview of the state policy work that Schoolhouse Connection does, how we look at the issues and what the key issues are that we focus on at our state policy work. From there, we'll be talking briefly about our advocacy network, which is a really critical piece to our work advocating across the country and a key way for you all to engage in this advocacy work. We'll talk through the legislation that we're going to be prioritizing across the country and some of the key issues that we're focusing on in states across the country. And then we'll finally wrap up with a little bit more about how you all can engage in advocacy, both in terms of some tools and resources, as well as opportunities that we can provide through the advocacy network. So let's start here by just framing the issues a little bit. And one thing that we always like to do at Schoolhouse Connection is really dig into the data. And so I want to start with that and kind of ground us in the numbers. As you can see here, 1.37 million students. This is the pre-K through 12 population in public schools across the country are experiencing homelessness. And of course, this is likely an undercount given the challenges in identifying these students. I also want to emphasize that this is an issue and a challenge in every part of every state. The rates, prevalence of homelessness being statistically identical in rural and urban areas. So this is not just an urban issue. This, as I said, is an issue across every part of all of our states. And unfortunately, as you can see here, the numbers have increased in recent years. with a 14% increase and a 25% increase from school year 2020 to 2021. I also want to make sure that you know that this doesn't actually include over 360,000 infants and toddlers. So these are the youngest of our children, the babies, ages birth through 3, that are experiencing homelessness. So a significant population there that's not even included in this number. We'll talk a little bit about what we're doing in that area here in a little bit. In addition to the data, it's also important to recognize how we're identifying these students and how Schoolhouse Connection looks at the issue of who is experiencing homelessness. Here you'll see the definition of homelessness that is based on federal statute, McKinney-Vento Act, and certainly it includes things like living in shelters and parks or cars, but I want to highlight in particular the first 2 pieces of that: folks who are living in motels and hotels, as well as sharing the housing of others because they've lost their own housing. And in fact, this first piece, what we call being doubled up, where you may be living in the house of a family, a friend, relative, encompasses 76% of the students across the country. So this is really the key, or the piece of the population that we're most talking about here. Again, 76% fall under the first point here of being doubled up. So with that in mind, I want to talk briefly through the issue areas that we focus on here at Schoolhouse Connection. Knowing that there are opportunities in both the federal government and state levels to impact all of these issue areas, from early childhood to pre-K to 12 education, higher education, unaccompanied homeless youth. And so these are the areas that we really focus on, and we're going to just briefly walk through each of these before moving on to the next section. So starting with early childhood, as I mentioned, over 360,000 0 to 3-year-olds are experiencing homelessness across our country. And of that number, only 11% of those infants and toddlers are currently identified and served by an early childhood program. So that means almost 90% of that 364,000 is not in an early childhood program, which is why it's so important from our perspective to increase access to those quality programs for these children. This is an area that we have looked at for a while on the technical assistance part of the issue at Schoolhouse Connection, but it's a newer area for our state policy team, and we're going to be really digging into this in coming months and really welcome any thoughts, ideas, opportunities that you know about in your state to impact early childhood access to programs for the infants and youth experiencing homelessness. The next area that I'm going to walk through briefly is the pre-K through 12 education, and this is certainly the area that has been the focus of a lot of Schoolhouse Connections work over the years, recognizing the importance for students to not only stay in school and receive that stability that they're maybe lacking in the rest of their lives, but also to really ensure that they're graduating from high school, recognizing how important that is as to reducing the continuation of folks experiencing homelessness once they move on in their lives. So we've worked on policies like addressing credit accrual and other ways that we can ensure that folks are graduating and succeeding through the K-12 system. The next area of our state policy work is higher education, and knowing that even once students do graduate from the K-12 system, they are still in need of additional support once they're in colleges and universities. And so one of the areas that we'll be talking about later today is this idea of designating and supporting higher education homeless student liaisons on college campuses and universities. And that's something that states have been looking at across the country, and we're working with a number of states to move that forward. And then the last bucket is the issue of unaccompanied homeless youth. So these are the youth who are not in the care of their parent or guardian. And there is a number of issues that we are looking at currently in this space that Rod will be talking about, including access to vital documents and medical care that these particular youth could need some support in. Before we move on, I did want to show this map here just to give you a sense of the scope of the work that Schoolhouse Connection has done over the years. As you can see, it's all across the country. We're looking to add some new states that we're working in this year. The other thing I wanted to add while we're on the slide is a sense of the type of work. Well, certainly much of the conversation today and generally speaking on our policy team is related to legislation. The other piece that we are also putting greater emphasis on is implementation of policies. So once those policies have passed, how are they being implemented? Are there ways that we can improve them? And are there other ways that we can engage in advocacy through more administrative type procedures with state departments and agencies? So that's something to keep in mind, though we won't be spending too much time on those today. I did want to make sure that y'all know that's part of what we look at as our policy advocacy, and absolutely welcome any thoughts on that type of advocacy in addition to the state legislative advocacy.
And Elliot, can I jump in for one moment?
Please do, Ron.
Yeah, Kathy just asked a question. If we have suggestions on a topic like early childhood education, should we include that in the Q&A section? And we're going to have space for discussion later on in the presentation. So we absolutely do encourage you to drop those suggestions about issues that you'd like to see focused on using the Q&A. And if you prefer the chat, I'll try my best to monitor that as well.
Thanks, Rod, and appreciate that, Kathy. And yeah, please do put anything and everything in those spaces. And as Rod said, there will be opportunities. So we'll both today, and we really want to emphasize that we welcome any ideas and feedback after today as well. So look forward to this being a continuing conversation. Which leads me to the next piece of my presentation here, talking about the Advocacy Network. And this is the network, in fact, created for just those kinds of conversations. Schoolhouse Connection created the Advocacy Network as a way for those types of conversations that were just mentioned to surface up and really direct the work that we're doing. As you can see, there's over 300 folks within the Advocacy Network all across the country, be it educators or youth or parents who have lived experience, other stakeholders. And we want to design this network for you all to be part of the advocacy process. In doing so, we want to also make sure that you all have the tools that you need to be effective advocates. So that includes putting forward webinars like the one you're on today, like the federal policy webinars I mentioned earlier, and sending regular updates, both to give you information about the issues that are coming, but also provide you opportunities to actually take action, right? It's about one, being informed, and two, taking steps towards action. To that end, within the last year, the Advocacy Network has engaged on a number of different policies, both at federal and state level. You'll see here there are examples where it was a broad outreach to your members of Congress, your senators and representatives on a couple of the key issues that we've worked on at the federal level. But we also want to focus direct advocacy at the state level, like the example here about Massachusetts, Michigan, and Pennsylvania making FAFSA completion a high school graduation requirement, or the social media posting in New York. So both looking at broad outreach across the country and very targeted and specific state outreach to representatives and policymakers. So with that, we want to get going a little bit on some of that feedback and opportunity to provide some more of your thoughts on the issues and challenges that you see in your states and communities. So I'm going to open up a poll here with an opportunity to weigh in on a few of the policies that we are looking at. In addition, if you don't see something here that necessarily resonates, please feel free to put your issues in the chat or the Q&A so we can capture those as well and have some opportunity for discussion later. So I'll give this 1 minute and then we'll move on. As a reminder, as these are popping up, make sure this is a good opportunity for you all to put any additional issues in the chat. All right, last opportunity before I close the poll. Looks like we have stopped receiving results. So here we go. Got one more. All right, I'm gonna end it there and share the results with you all. So these are the issues that we're going to be talking about here: the accessing medical care, obtaining documents, and supporting folks, students in higher education. Appreciate you all taking a minute to weigh in on how that is impacting children and youth in your communities. I see there's a number of people who also entered the other button, so look forward to reviewing the chat and having those conversations and within the discussion at the end. So with all that, I'm going to turn this next portion over to Rod.
Thank you, Elliot, and good afternoon and welcome once again. I am going to start by answering a question that Gina just posed about discussing academic credit accrual. She's coordinating some services for youth who are seeking credit recovery supports and have county workers in Minnesota. And she's open to sharing and learning from others. I appreciate you raising that issue. I am going to drop into the chat one of our issue briefs dealing with issues related to high school graduation, including credit accrual and the recognition of partial credits as a way in which we address this from a state policy perspective. And if you are interested in following up with Elliot or myself, we welcome that conversation and you'll have our contact information to review again later in the presentation. So moving on, as Elliot referenced before, we've been really active in state policy from a number of different levels across the U.S. So far, Schoolhouse has helped pass legislation to one extent or another in 28 states. We have worked on a number of issues, as Elliot reviewed, and we'll continue to try to help our allies and people impacted by homelessness in whatever capacity we can. We prioritize our work in those buckets that Elliot referenced around early childhood, pre-K through 12, higher education, and the broadest or largest bucket, those policies impacting unaccompanied youth experiencing homelessness. And we really see our work continuing in all those areas headed into 2025. We're going to focus on a few areas that have really risen in a number of states, and they also tie to our survey results. Elliot, if you could head to the next one. Thank you. Uh, Trying to provide greater access to medical care and treatment is an issue that has really been prominent in a number of states. There are 35 states in the District of Columbia that have some sort of law allowing minors who are unaccompanied to access routine medical care and dental care and treatment, which is a huge issue for those young people who don't have a parent or guardian in their lives to provide them access. Most states provide access to emergency treatment, but not the routine medical care that youth often need but cannot get now. Um, the number of states that we have worked on these bills in my time here at Schoolhouse has grown considerably, and we have met some challenges because of a number of politically related motivations that have kind of held these bills up. And it's not unique to a red state or a blue state or a purple state. We've really seen states across the political spectrum struggle with how to advance these bills. We worked on legislation providing unaccompanied youth, specifically the ability to consent to their own care and treatment in both Michigan and Wisconsin last year, and supported some legislation elsewhere. But think that we may have a viable path forward and are working towards introducing legislation on medical consent again in 2025. We also are considering some other states and welcome any input you all have relative to opportunities in your states. Access to vital documents is another issue that will remain prominent in the work that we do because of the importance that obtaining a driver's license, a birth certificate, or a state ID has on a young person's ability to access housing, education, training programs, or navigate systems needed to meet their basic needs. So we look at legislation that would provide them the opportunity to consent um, without a parent or guardian in the cases where they're unaccompanied, and also to remove the barriers that fees might present for young people who struggle financially. There's been progress made each year, and there's also been an increased interest in this issue in more and more states each year, which I'm really pleased to see. We anticipate there being a path forward for some bills, and we'll be working on either introducing or reintroducing bills in about a half dozen states, including those you see listed here, as well as trying to improve upon some legislation that has passed in a couple of states that was more focused on assisting individuals experiencing homelessness overall, but didn't have a youth-specific component. So we would look at going back and amending those bills to make sure that youth are explicitly referenced and able, therefore, to get the assistance they need to obtain those vital documents. And we've also been pleased by the increased interest in providing youth in higher education with the resources they need to navigate into and through colleges and universities around the country. There have been 9 states that have passed legislation requiring colleges and universities to designate higher ed liaisons, and that's one of the critical components to greater higher education support because liaisons provide a number of essential connections for those youth who are struggling to get into school and then get the support that they need, including housing and access to other services. Um, we've seen states pass similar legislation focused on providing that kind of support for youth in foster care or coming out of foster care. So we'll be looking at how we are able to identify opportunities for the designation of liaisons to help students experiencing homelessness specifically in some of those states, like Texas, for example, which have a component of that provides that support for youth in foster. So that'd be expanding that legislation to include the youth experiencing homelessness as well. And then in those states that don't have a designation, we'd be looking to try to create that by passage of a bill specifically aimed at um, those liaisons. And then for those states that are interested in pursuing it, but the will may not be there to pursue something legislatively, we're also looking at what we might be able to do administratively to get college systems to adopt the designation of a single point of contact. And that has been done in New York, for example, in recent years, where the state university system adopted single points of contact across their campuses. So we are hopeful in that the interest in trying to get more support on higher education campuses is there, and there's also, I think, sufficient support to look at, in addition to single points of contact, the other areas that can be addressed as well, whether it's priority and enrollment in housing and employment or waiving fees associated with the cost of attendance as well. Recognizing that young people, even though they may be in college, are still dealing with some of the severe impact of homelessness, and that really needs to be addressed if they're going to be able to successfully navigate their way through college and graduate and achieve those maximum educational outcomes. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Elliot.
Well, thanks so much, Rod, and I hope everybody that was helpful for you all to dig in a little bit more on those three particular policies and get a sense of where we'll be pursuing those policies this upcoming legislative session. And certainly want you all to be keeping in mind if you live in those states or any of the other states that we're mentioning. We're going to talk a little bit more in this next section about how to actually engage in that advocacy, and also knowing that we, as Rod mentioned, are always looking to support partners in other states. So don't feel like this is an exhaustive list. We want to be supporting this work wherever you all are doing that. And that gets me right to this particular slide, knowing that you all are really the ones who need to be engaged in order for this issue to rise up. Certainly, in one way, you are the ones who are working on this issue day in and day out. So you are really the experts. Certainly, legislators, policymakers don't have the expertise that you all have it. And frankly, if you all and the other partners that do this work are not talking about it, no one else will be. So it's really important that we are all raising these issues in particular, knowing that we're the ones who are going to be doing that. The other thing I want to always emphasize in spaces like this is beyond what professional roles you may hold as constituents for these legislators. I like to say that you're really their boss. You're the ones who get to tell them how they should be making policy. You're the ones who are voting them in or out of office. So, keeping that in mind, you all have a lot of power, and we want to certainly harness that power in effective advocacy through our work here at Schoolhouse Connection. In order to do that, we really emphasize knowing the issue, And so you can see here, there's a few key links for some policy tools and resources. As I mentioned, join the Advocacy Network. We'll keep you informed on what's happening all across the country and ways you can take action. And we have a dedicated page to all our state advocacy work with a lot of resources on all these issues that we've talked about today and more. I also want to highlight this last link here. This is a publication that Schoolhouse Connection contributed to, along with several other partners across the country. And by going to this link, you'll be routed to one of our web pages and eventually to the resource itself, which is a book that goes through all the issues we talked about today and many more. And what I like about it is it, number one, gives you all the background and information on why these policies are important. But number two, actually provides a model language that can be incorporated and adapted in your state on all these different issues. You can actually access the entire book online, so you don't even need to order a copy. The next tool that I want to highlight here is one that we utilize all the time. And this is, again, accessed through our website, the data profile set. And so this is going to show you all kinds of great information on who exactly we're talking about across the country. You can filter out by age and living arrangement, etc. And most critically for the work that we do, you can also narrow that by legislative district, congressional district. So you can actually walk into a meeting or email your representative, call them up and say, and give them the picture of what's actually happening in their district. And so we found that to be a really effective tool. I will say that some of the numbers I referenced earlier in the presentation are more updated than what's on this website, but we are going to be updating the website very soon here with updated data. So again, really encourage you in your conversations and advocacy to access this information so you can really paint the picture of what's happening in your state or community.
And Elliot, can I step in once again?
Yeah,
I just
please.
wanted to address a couple of the comments that were in the chat. I dropped a link in on a page on our site that we are using to try to compile information regarding housing related resources. A couple of people mentioned housing as an issue, and I'm sure it's a problem in the states represented here on the call, as we see it everywhere. I know from a state policy perspective, it's something we're interested in being more attentive to, particularly as it relates to the connection between education and the housing of students. We have seen some progress made in recent years in a couple of states that have taken action to provide McKinney-Vento liaisons greater involvement in addressing some of the housing stability related issues of their students, including in Maine and in Maryland, which have passed laws over the last couple of years, providing liaisons an opportunity, in the case of Maine, to directly assist their students who are struggling with housing stability in their families with cash to address some of those things that could result in them becoming homeless. And in Maryland, a legislation was passed recently providing eviction prevention assistance to McKinney-Vento students and their families and community schools there. So there has been some action taken, and we really try to lift up those examples for legislators who are interested in trying to find some creative solutions to addressing housing stability related issues in their states as well. And I will also drop the link to the slides in the chat for you all again, for those who came in after I did so initially.
I just threw them in there, Rod.
Okay.
Great. Yeah, we appreciate that conversation on housing, and we can certainly continue it towards the end of the session, we're actually wrapping up here. Just have, I think, one or two more slides that I want to go through. And this one is really just kind of a way to wrap everything together in terms of what we do, with the resources, with the data and information. Now that we have talked through the specific issues, is how are we actually taking action? We mentioned earlier some of the things the Advocacy Network had done over this past year in terms of emails and phone calls, as well as posting on social media. And those are all critical parts of the work that we do and will continue to be so. And certainly want to encourage you to look out for those action alerts and ways to take action in that way. But I also want to emphasize the importance of actually getting in front of your policymakers through meetings and or providing testimony in committee. I think certainly the emails and phone calls and social media posts are useful and make a difference, but nothing can really substitute for sitting down with a policymaker or providing testimony on a critical issue. We are more than happy to help facilitate those conversations. As you may imagine, many legislators these days do virtual meetings, so it doesn't necessarily need to be in person in case you're not near the Capitol, wherever you're living. And some states even allow for remote testimony. So we're certainly happy to help facilitate and find opportunities for that and provide you all with testimony preparations and talking points and things of that nature. And also, again, encourage you to reach out to us if there are opportunities. As these policies move through the various state houses, having people testify from your expertise and experiences can't be overstated how helpful that is in the policymaking process and how important it is for legislators and policymakers to actually see you and have an opportunity, hopefully, to have some dialogue with you and learn from you and all the experience that you bring. So with that, we are actually going to wrap that portion and move on to some opportunity for questions and discussion. And I will just reiterate as we do how important it is from our perspective that we are hearing from you at Schoolhouse Connection to really inform the work that we do, as you all are on the ground or have perhaps lived experiences that can inform our work. And so I want to encourage you both right now in our discussion session, but also opportunities to reach out to us as you're moving forward and giving us ideas and examples and asking for support as appropriate. I saw one person in the Q&A offer something in particular that's happening in Waco, and those are great examples of things that are helpful for us to be sharing and thinking about policies that might be able to build on those successful partnerships. Thank you, Kathy, for adding that. So I'll stop there and leave some opportunity for people to put any questions in the chat or engage through the Q&A. Looks like we have Judy's indicated that they're going to Phoenix for a marketing company to be part of a commercial that promotes awareness on McKinney-Vento, which is great that that is happening. Any advice on what could be said in the interview? I don't know, Rod, if we have any specific resources that we could point to in that space. I know that we have a lot on our website about McKinney-Vento, but in terms of somebody who's actually speaking to the media or in that space.
Yeah, I would ask Judy to follow up with us. We can provide one pager and some talking points that might be beneficial.
And Judy, in a minute, I'll put up our contact information again. And it's also included on the slide deck, so feel free to pull either of our emails to reach out. Be happy to help you with that. We have a dedicated communications team as well at Schoolhouse, so certainly they could be a great resource.
Yep, and we can also provide information from um, our data profiles that Elliot highlighted previously, that can illustrate some of the Phoenix area specific data that would be of interest.
I'm interested. I know that a good portion of people indicated an other within the poll that we had in terms of other issues that maybe weren't part of that poll. Curious to hear more about those if folks are willing to interested in sharing. And I do see we just got another chat, so I'll take a look at that.
Nadia just posted some information about her dissertation focused on evaluating the implementation of Pennsylvania's HEI websites to assure single point of contact information is accessible on all websites. In keeping with the 2019 law that passed there. And I would welcome an opportunity to review what you compile. I can share with you that that is a challenge in some states that don't have single points of contact, but are trying to help youth experiencing homelessness. And a lot of people aren't aware. As I mentioned earlier, there are 9 states that have some laws, but there are colleges across the country that are doing as much as they can to try to serve the youth experiencing homelessness to some extent. We push for legislation in order to codify support mechanisms to try to ensure to the extent possible that the level of support provided students would be consistent across campuses in a specific state, which legislation creates a framework for doing. Because we've talked to young people who've indicated challenges trying to find information or connect with the folks on their campuses who are designated to help them. But there hasn't been a system put in place to make that a requirement, and the promotion of that person that comes along with part of it. So the work being done there is of interest to us, and if you're able to send along that information once you are ready to release it, I greatly appreciate it.
I see Trisha had asked about advocating for state level policy around higher education. So and we certainly do have resources and materials to support that. I'll pull some of those as we're kind of chatting here to put into the website so you can see that. And it's a conversation, as Rod referenced, we're always happy to connect directly with you all. But I think certainly and interested, Rod, in your thoughts, but it's helpful, number one, to know kind of what the policies are, but then also we found it's helpful to map out who's engaged in those conversations, whether it's higher education departments, different various community college or four-year institutions. What kind of structures do those have to both share and discuss changes? As Rod mentioned, we've been looking at these types of policies at a legislative level, but also at an administrative level. Sometimes you don't need legislation to make these kind of changes. So working through your institutions and organizations focused on higher education is one avenue. I'll see if Rod has any other quick tips while I pull up some of those resources.
No, I think that's exactly right. One of the things we intend to do through the briefs we prepare is give people some ideas of what's been done elsewhere. So as they're thinking about the ways in which they may get involved in advocacy in their states, they have some examples to follow. And it's also helpful moving forward to provide something for legislators to look at and potentially emulate because they frequently ask when it comes to reform suggestions, what's been done elsewhere. And so we try to compile those resources, particularly lifting up those best examples as a resource for both advocates and for lawmakers. I noticed Kathy posed a question about the higher ed liaisons in Texas, and I absolutely do have some talking points that I'm happy to share with you. If you just email me, I can follow up. And those will be based on the legislation that we help support with our advocacy partners in Texas over the last session.
Thanks, Avery, for sharing that piece about Tulsa and the focus on eviction as a barrier for students attending school. It's great to hear that you've been working with a coalition to pass that ordinance. And I'd be interested to learn more about that, and in particular, kind of what you've seen as the results. I don't know if how recently that happened, but certainly housing, as we already talked about, is a big piece of the puzzle and something that we are digging in to find those intersections more and more all the time. So interested to hear more about how that has played out in Tulsa. Feel free to email us more information. Looks like we have a comment here on access to transportation. That's a huge barrier. Certainly, many of the students and youth that we're seeing facing all across the country um, with this population in particular. I think it's broadly an issue in schools across the country, but particularly this population that we're talking about. And thinking through, there are some states, though not too many, that have started to dedicate specific funding to address this, and that's another thing that we're doing a little more research on. So thanks, Michelle, for bringing that up. So there's a comment from Martha about policies on migrant immigration, given that some resources do not allow applications for lack of social security. I think SSC, Social Security card, is my guess there. I don't know if we have specific resources on that, though. Certainly, one of our, as I mentioned, a lot of the work that we do is not just other members of our team do is not just in the policy space, but in the technical assistance and support. And I know that some of our staff has really been looking at that issue from a K-12 perspective, recognizing some of the additional barriers that people face in that space. Rod, I don't know if you have more to add there.
No, I think that's appropriate.
Last question, how can we assist our youth getting Social Security cards. It's definitely one of the areas that we've been trying to focus on is access to vital documents, focusing more so on driver's licenses and birth certificates. Rod, I don't know if that has included Social Security cards or not, given that those I believe may be issued at a federal, not a state level, but I could be mistaken there.
Yeah, and I'm wondering if that question relates to the challenge of getting identity documents in order to get a replacement Social Security card or a Social Security card if they've never had one, which falls under the realm of vital documents because getting a birth certificate as a starting point to getting other identity documents is often a challenge. So we do work on state policy related to that.
Janice, if hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, you also mentioned certificates for the workshops. We didn't have one set for this one, but if it's something that it would be helpful for you to have for some professional development or something like that, we might be able to figure that out if you can just email me or Rod.
Yeah, our staff, as part of the technical assistance work that we do, leads trainings from time to time, which I think is what Janice is referring to. This type of webinar doesn't fall into that category, but it is something that Schoolhouse has participated in.
Well, as we are wrapping up here, I did want to make sure to provide folks more opportunities to connect either with Rod or myself or the organization as a whole through our various social media platforms. So you can see those here, really active on all these spaces. So whatever is best for you, I believe Schoolhouse Connection will have a way to connect in that regard. Also, again, want to make sure that everyone's plugging into our advocacy network. That's the way that you're really going to be able to stay on top of all the different things that are happening all over the country, and as importantly, ways to engage and actually advocate. So please do sign up for our advocacy network. And here again are our contact information. And I really do appreciate everyone taking the time today. Please, again, feel free to reach out uh, moving forward on any of these issues, and we look forward to continuing the conversation. I do see one last comment here about finding shelters and shelters being out of capacity. So any ideas on what can be done to help with that? And looks like Rod has posted an eviction prevention bill that passed in Maryland. That's great.
Yeah, someone raised that issue previously, which made me recall the fact that the legislation that passed there, I mentioned earlier, was heavily driven, if not initiated, by some of the housing advocates in the state. So I think there could potentially be opportunity where you are as well.
The question about shelters, I don't know any specific policies, Rod. Maybe you have some other examples as well, but certainly one of the things that we're always looking to do just broadly across this issue area is increase funding from states and look at some dedicated funding to support this youth and students that we are working with and for. So certainly funding is a broadly a way to address that, but I'm sure there are also some more creative solutions that can be done at the local level that some folks on this call might also have ideas for.
Yeah, I mean, lack of shelter and housing are universal, ongoing issues that you all and others are dealing with in every state. And while we focus more on education, as I mentioned previously as well, we want to try to be more deliberate and intentional about trying to lift up opportunities to make the connection between education and housing and support the work that housing advocacy partners are doing.
Thanks, Michelle, for that
Yeah.
input. All right. Well, unless there's anything more before we close out here, I'm gonna bid you all a good rest of your day. And again, really appreciate you participating in our webinar today, and hope to hear from you all moving forward, and look forward to advocating alongside you in this work. Thanks, everyone.